to Podcasting 101 with me, your host, Rachel. This podcast is for female business owners and solopreneurs that are looking to start a podcast that adds to your own already awesome offering. I'll give you helpful advice that you can take away and use in your podcasting journey. I hope to answer those tricky questions that just keep you from starting. Once a month, I'll be joined by other female podcasters. They'll share their journey with you and offer tips and advice they discovered along the way. Let's get started. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode. Today, I am joined with Janet Murray, and she is a content and online business strategist specialising in launch and content strategy. Her current podcast is called the Courageous Content Podcast. Welcome, Janet.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here, and with somebody with a lot of experience in podcasting, as we were just talking before we hit record. Why don't you let us know a little bit about what you do and why you wanted to start a podcast for your business?
So I have to reach back quite far now, because I think I started my first podcast, I think it was back in 2017, I can't even remember now, but I'm on my second podcast, my second public podcast, and I have about 10, including private ones now, which we might get onto later. So what I do now is, quite rightly, as you said, I call myself an online content and online business strategist. So I help small business owners to create content that basically helps them to make more money and in their business, or to make enough money. Often that can be the case. And obviously content, social media content, podcast content, email marketing, blog content, the quality of that is key. I also help people with launch strategy, which can sound like quite a big, scary word when you first start out. But I often say to people, if you've ever sold anything to anybody, you've had a launch, and you know, even if you're selling one-to-one, or you're working as a VA and you're taking on your first client, and you're offering some kind of service, that's a launch. And so I try and encourage people to think about launching a podcast, for example. Everything has to be launched, from that very first service up to the kind of things that I do now. I do these big complex funnels with upsells and downsells and cross sells, which I would have imagined when I first started. So I started a podcast because, for two reasons. So like most things in my business, I kind of just fell into doing it and thought it would be a good idea. So I thought I'd have a go. So I was a journalist beforehand, and I was kind of building up this online business on the side. Didn't really know that was what I was building, but basically I started off, I was teaching people about press and PR to start off with, actually, and pitching to the press, because that was my background, and I've gradually pivoted. But I started blogging about that topic and kind of thought, how do I get more people to find out about this blog? Maybe I will start building an email list, and maybe I'll do more social media. And I just gradually lots of things started to click into place. And I loved listening to podcasts. I listened to a lot of business podcasts at the time that I found really helpful. And I thought, I fancy having a go at that. And I think I could do it. Like, at the time, I used to listen to Pat Flynn's Smart Passive Income podcast. And I had various people that I was really addicted to their podcasts. I used to go out running and listen to different podcasts for hours on end. I thought, I fancy having a go at that. It seems like a really good way to reach people. And what appealed to me was that podcasts, so the apps that I listen to podcasts on, they're like little search engines themselves. So when I'm interested in a topic, I'll be on the app seeing who's got a podcast on that topic, or who has created content on that topic. So for me, it felt like a really great way for people to find you. But also, beyond actually searching within podcast apps, looking for things to listen to, there's the whole SEO side of it. So people will find you when they're searching on Google for particular topics. And I've had some podcasts that have been first in Google for particular search terms, which is really helpful. Not for the ones I would have most wanted, but usually for ones that actually, I don't do that anymore. I don't offer that anymore. But it just shows the power of showing up and creating regular content. And the other side of it, I'm not sure I would have even been able to explain this at the time, but it just felt like the podcasters that I listened to, I felt like I knew them, and I felt like I liked them, and I look forward to their latest episode coming out, and it was useful, and I liked the fact that they were introducing me to other people that might be useful to me. And I kind of felt like being a voice in someone's ear, that kind of intimacy, that connection seemed to me, and even though I'm a writer by trade, it just seemed like there was something really powerful about that. So I just kind of thought that seems fun. I think that could be quite useful. I think I'll have a go at that.
I think that's a really good attitude, though, because I think I've talked about this with several other people, the barrier to starting sometimes of perfectionism or thinking that you're not going to be any good at it. And I think that giving it a go is really important. A lot of advice of some of the podcast hosts I've interviewed as being just to try it. And I agree as well about the intimacy of podcasts as well. You feel like you get to know them, and that's really, really powerful. Like you say, that's a great thing to be able to do with your podcast, and one of the advantages, I think, of having a podcast for your business.
Yeah, definitely.
So you decided to do your podcast. What kind of planning was involved in, and has that evolved over the years? Like you say, you've had a couple of different podcasts and private ones. What kind of planning did you do?
Well, I think what was useful for me, because I was a journalist before, I did think that gave me an advantage, because I sort of had this understanding of, you don't create content for yourself, you create content for your audience. And again, without probably writing it down or even knowing I was doing it, I was thinking, well, who are the people that I need to listen to this podcast for it to pay for itself and work for my business and attract the kind of people that I would love to work with? Who are those people? What kind of content do they need from me? And it really came from just thinking about, what are the questions I get asked all the time? So when my podcast first started, I was specialising in helping people with press and PR, and I hardly do any of that anymore at all. I just don't do it because my business has really changed. But I thought about the questions that people ask me. So how do I write a press release? How do I pitch to a journalist? How do I find out which editor to pitch to? So I started off just thinking about those questions. And then as I started to move more into online marketing, which is the best email marketing platform, what should I post on Instagram stories, and just the things that people were talking to me and asking me that I knew more about and had, authority and not even authority, but experience at the time. And again, I probably didn't even consciously know I was doing it. I was just like, I just want to be helpful. So I answered people's questions in the solo episodes, but in the interview episodes, I thought about who would my ideal listeners, who would they really want to hear from? Who would they find really useful? How can I help them build a community, and also just to build that kind of network of experts that I thought about some of the podcasts that I listened to and how many other podcasters that they'd introduced me to were useful people that had really, really helped me. And I thought about, how can I do that for my audience? Like, how can I just basically be a helpful resource?
Yeah. When I wanted to start this podcast, that's what I was thinking about, is trying to think about what your audience wants to hear. And that's a really important thing when you're thinking about the content or coming up with the content for your podcast, is to think about what your audience would like to hear.
Yeah. I think there's a danger of navel gazing when you create content that you want to listen to, and that's okay if it's a hobby podcast. But if it's a podcast where you're being strategic about it, and even if you wouldn't use that word, if you're starting a podcast because you want it to generate customers or clients, you are being strategic. So if you say, I'm going to create this podcast to help me attract clients, and then it's all about just stuff that you're interested in, or you're talking about yourself all the time, then you might enjoy that and that might be great, but you're probably not going to get the results that you hope for.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. You weren't consciously thinking about your target audience, but who would you say is your target audience for your podcast right now?
So entrepreneurs, or they may not even call themselves entrepreneurs, business owners. So it is mainly women, and not by choice, really. It's just kind of how it's worked out. So women who are running businesses, typically they tend to be in their 30s, 40s, 50s. They've got children, usually. They're often juggling their business alongside but raising a family, or they've got caring commitments. But I think it needs to go beyond that. I'm not a big fan of those kind of avatars. Like for me, it's about what's the sort of emotion that brings them together, or what's the feeling. So that's where I ended up later on with courageous content, I think, although it took me years to kind of get there. But what unites a lot of my listeners, I think, is needing a bit of help in that area. So wanting to put content out in the world, but feeling, is what I've got to say important enough, or am I good enough, or does my voice sound funny, or do I look silly on camera? And so something that's always at the heart of what I create. And interestingly, it's not something I particularly struggle with, but I do understand that in other people. And so something that I've always just try and break things down, make them simple, and give people the structures that they need to take action. Because I think, how many people think about starting a podcast for years, or talk about it, or how many clients do I come across who have written an outline for a podcast, or they've written a concept for an online course, or whatever it might be, and they're too scared to take that step forward. So when I think about my ideal listeners, that's the thing I think that brings them together. It's not like a kind of, they're this age, they drive this car, but it's more about they often have really great skills and they have a lot to offer, but for whatever reason they feel a little bit nervous about putting their voice out in the world, and will often hold back on doing so. So when I'm thinking about the kind of content I create, I'm always trying to think about, how can I make this really easy? What structures can I provide to almost give them a push off the side, without saying like, oh, just get on with it. Like, how can it's sort of acknowledging that I think often for women as well, it can be more difficult. They can be more fearful of criticism. And so I feel like I do understand who it is I'm talking to, but it goes beyond the kind of avatar, if you see what I mean. It's more about the feelings, the emotions that they share, I think.
Yeah, it is quite a deep way to think about it, but it does make more sense than actually thinking about it, like you say, women in business. It is about that feeling, and that would really appeal. I mean, I'm kind of your demographic. I'm in my late 30s and I started my own business, and those kind of fears came up for me as well. So listening to something that speaks to that would really resonate with me. And that's exactly what you want to get out of your podcast, your content.
Yeah, and I do think, it's hard as well, because you don't always know. Well, often you don't know that until you just are brave enough to put some content out in the world. And then you start to say, oh, I see, I'm really resonant. That episode I did on this, or this piece of content really resonated. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people want to write that bit before they've created any content. And I think, unfortunately, you just have to get out there, put some stuff out there and see what lands. And that's when you start to really understand who that audience is, and you get better and better at creating the kind of content they want.
Yeah. How would you say that your podcasts have evolved? Has it taken you, so you started, say, back in 2016. Did you find it was quite a long process to get to where you are now in terms of recognizing what your audience needs from you?
I think I was always sort of quite good at that because of my background as a content creator, as a journalist. I know it's a different type of discipline, but it's still about giving people what they want or need. And so I do always say to people, be kind to yourself, because I do recognise I've got a bit of an advantage or a privilege in that area, because I was already doing that, but in a different sort of way. I've definitely got a lot better. So my first few episodes, I worried so much about my voice, and I worried I sound like, hello, listen to my podcast started. It's been had about 4 different name changes, and it was like the Soulful PR podcast, and it was like, hello, welcome to the Soulful PR podcast. And I think what I've learned is that it's okay to be yourself, and it's okay to, in fact, it's better with podcasting. And I used to worry about, I have this sort of, I was born up north, so I was born in Liverpool, and I moved to Kent in my, when I was about 6 or 7. So you move to like the south with a Scouse accent when you're 6 or 7, and I went to a school who had like elocution lessons, so I had this very sort of confused thing. And sometimes I feel like I have the odd word where I'll just say something a bit northern sounding, so all my family are Scousers, and then I hear this like sort of like local accent, you know, how critical we are of each other's, of our own voices, not each other's. And I think at first I kind of was afraid to just speak in my normal voice. And when I listen back to those first episodes, I think, oh God, and also it just didn't sound like I had much personality. And actually, I think that the more that you do it and the more relaxed you are, often the content's a lot better, and people do need to hear you laugh, and they do need to sometimes hear you go off with your little stories sometimes or whatever. But again, if only we could all be perfect the first few episodes. The only way we get there is to be is just to do it. And when I relaunched my podcast, that was last year, so that was 2021, I wanted to make my podcast episodes a lot shorter, because I felt like, even though I had an editor, I felt like you'd get somebody on a call and you'd spend the first 15-20 minutes sort of trying to get to know them. And I know as a listener, sometimes I feel a bit frustrated because I just want to get to the juicy bit. I want to get to the meat. And I felt sometimes it took me a long time actually to get to the point of asking a question. And so I actually had some coaching about 6 or 7 years in to kind of improve my interviewing skills, because I found sometimes I'd listen back and it would take me about 4 goes to get to where I wanted to go. And sometimes that's great, but sometimes it can be a bit frustrating for the listener. But again, you can't know that unless you actually create some content and you listen to yourself back. And my content was fine, what I was putting out, but it was almost like I got to the point where I thought, well, actually, I've been doing this for a while. I wonder if I can do it better. So I've gone off on track now, anyway, what you asked in the first place, but I've definitely changed. And I think, I feel like I didn't see myself as a podcaster. I'm actually going to Podcast Movement. I'm going to a podcasting event in Dallas at the end of the month.
I really would love to go to one of the podcasting events over there.
I went to one in London. It was the first one I'd ever been to, and I speak as well, but I just never thought of going. I just didn't really see myself as a podcaster, but I am.
Yeah, because I hadn't, when I first came across you, I didn't realise quite how much podcasting that you've done. I came across you on Instagram for your content creation. I think I downloaded something from you. I think it was last year. But yeah, the podcast, was that the one in London in May?
Yeah.
Because I really wanted to go to that when my husband was away, so I couldn't wangle that trip to London. But I looked at some of the because I'm part of Captivate as well. They sent out some emails and updates and things from what happened at the show, and it was just really interesting to see what was going on there if you're a podcaster.
Well, I think the thing is that I guess the reason I've never got into that world is because I used to be quite I had this like little microphone, a Blue Snowball microphone, and I only upgraded after about 3 or 4 years. And actually, my husband bought me a new microphone, and I kept it in the box for the year because I liked this other one. And then I thought I probably ought to, maybe get a slightly better microphone. But I didn't see myself as a podcaster because this is just a medium. It's just a way of me communicating. And what I'm getting to here is that there can be this idea that podcasting is all people. I've met so many people who have never published a podcast or have maybe published 2 episodes, and they're talking down to you about podcast mics or mixers or equipment. And they're like, how many? Well, I've published 500 podcast episodes, and you're telling me what I should be doing better. And I think sometimes it can feel like that's the world, and it isn't. I found there really are nice people, but I didn't really identify as being a podcaster because for me it was just like plug in my microphone. I didn't realise what I knew as well about how to, because it isn't just about the tech. Obviously, it's important to have good quality audio, but it doesn't have to be like broadcast standard to be useful. You don't need loads of kit. You don't need to spend loads of money. The bits that can really make the difference are like how you actually plan your episodes and the content and how you promote them. But I think sometimes podcasting can seem like it's all techie, and I was glad that I stepped into that world. I thought I actually know quite a lot about this, and actually the important bits, because it isn't all about the tech and the mixers and the mics. You know, it's got its place, but there's so much more to it.
Yeah, I when I first started, that's the one bit that I was kind of a bit worried about. My husband's a sound engineer as well, and he was so helpful with me, helping me get set up, and not even with like really expensive stuff really, but just things that can work at home. And I had this kind of image in my head about broadcasting and that, oh, it's BBC standard, and felt like that was a bit of a barrier until I started, and then started delving into like the podcast world and listening to lots of different people's podcasts, and knowing that actually that is a very small part. Yes, you want to have nice, clear audio. Yes, you want to record it on something and that's going to work for you. But like you say, your podcast, if your podcast is perfectly sounded, but it's not resonating with your audience, or the content's not there, what is the point of your podcast? So in actual fact, if that's going to be a barrier to you starting, you're better off just having your AirPods, recording into your phone or to Anchor or something like that, and worry about your content. And then you can evolve once you are comfortable with everything that you're doing, really. Yeah. So that's kind of what I try and recommend people who've said to me, you know, I was like, don't let that stop you from starting if you've got a great idea that or your message you want to give out to your audience.
Yeah, and it's so easy, especially I use Captivate now, but I didn't when we first started. My old podcast is still on Libsyn, and I had to, but I always say to people, I did it, and I wouldn't say I was a particularly techie person, but I had to. Libsyn is not quite so smooth in the back end as Captivate, like Captivate just makes everything so easy. It's step by step. You don't need to be techie at all to get your podcast on iTunes or whatever. But I had to kind of do this not workaround, but I had to use two tools on my website. I used Blueberry and Libsyn, but I got a friend who had a podcast to show me how to do it. We got on a Zoom call. She showed me how to do it. I wouldn't say I was that techie at all, and I managed it no problem at all. And I think sometimes people I always say to my clients, if they're launching, I sometimes work with clients who are launching a podcast with their launch strategy, and I say, stop even thinking about that bit, because that's the easy bit. Like the hard bit is coming up with a concept or a topic for a podcast that people actually want to listen to, planning out your first season or whatever it is that you're doing, and making those episodes, really great content. The tech bit is all figure outable. It's not anywhere near as tricky as it seems. Like, just focus, and like you say, if it could be the best produced podcast in the world, but if the content isn't good, if it's not a good fit for your audience, it's not going to,
not going to resonate.
No.
So what would you recommend in terms of planning? Have you got any tips or advice around the planning side of things for your podcast? Like, for example, I kind of recommend people like saying that podcasting is a bit of a long game, and trying to work out their commitment and work out exactly what they can commit to, and then planning out their episodes.
Yeah, so the best bit of advice I've been given, which I give to clients all the time, which I didn't take myself, but it's because my personality is different. I think you have to take into account your capacity, your resources. If you've got young children, or you've got other commitments, or you've still got a day job, you could set out to do 5 podcasts a week or something. And most podcasts, when you look at the research, they don't go beyond the first or second episode. And because they sort of sign up to it thinking, I've got to do this forever. So the best piece of advice I've been given, which although I didn't take, my clients have taken and have been very glad of it, is just to start off with a season. So instead of thinking, I'm going to launch a podcast and I'm going to do this forever and ever and ever, just go, okay, I'm going to launch a podcast and I'm going to do 6 or 8 episodes on a topic that I feel comfortable either talking about or can find other people to talk about. And I'm just going to do that. And then if that goes well, or, you know, I can take a step back and then I can come back with another season. And I think where people get themselves in a tears, I think sometimes, is when they're like, right, I'm starting a podcast and now I've got to do it every week forever, or I've got to do it every other week. Whereas if you just say, well, look, I'm just going to do a short series of 6 to 8 episodes or whatever, see how this goes, get them done, get them out there. You can come back with another season. You can then go to a podcast that happens all year round after that. But I feel like sometimes people get so bogged down in what's going to be happening in 30 episodes that they never make the first 4 to 6. And I think that's a good piece of advice that I've been given. I say I haven't taken it personally, because I've got the kind of personality that's just like, oh, I'm just doing it and I just managed to do it. But I've seen it work with clients. I think it really takes the pressure off. And the second thing is this thing about being strategic. So, and I've got better and better at this over the years, but if you're going to go to the trouble of recording a podcast series, hopefully a season, and it would be a good way to start. What's your goal? Like, what do you want to sell at the end? So I'm just about to launch a podcast, which is it's a private podcast I'm repurposing as a public podcast. And its goal is to sell one product that I know sells really well when I put it out by email on social media, but this will be a way of having people buying this product all the time. So it's on a very, very specific topic. So what's your goal? Is your goal to get X number of new clients, or is it to sell a particular program, or is it because then you can do things like right from the off, you can do things like you can create a special offer or a discount code or something, so that you know that the listeners of your podcast, you know what they're doing. So it could be a special email lead magnet or a special, but if you just kind of, it's easy for me to say this for so many years of experience, but like it costs time and it can cost a little bit of money. And I would recommend getting somebody to help with editing and show notes if you can do from the off, because it will save you a lot of time if you can just focus on the content, if that's possible. It's not always possible, but there is quite a bit of time and resources involved. And being able to measure whether, you know, you're not going to get overnight success, but if it's working, you will see some glimmers. You know, you'll see, oh, you know, I got one inquiry, and it, you know, you might not be a millionaire overnight, but it's just sort of thinking, what's my purpose of this? And instead of trying to sell everything, or, you know, just think about, well, I'm going to focus this season on one product or one service, or getting this many clients. I've got a friend who's got a podcast which has a tiny audience in comparison to mine, but it makes like loads more money because it's very specific, it's very for a niche audience. And in every episode, she talks about her main product that she sells. It doesn't matter if you've got 10 listeners, if those 10 listeners are doing what you want them to do, or who cares? Like, so that's probably quite a few things in one. I could probably go on for ages, but but there are a few things that come to mind.
I never thought about doing a specific season and then targeting to that specific product. But that's a great idea. That is like you said, an easier way to see the kind of response that you're getting if you have that special code created for that specific series. That's one thing I was going to ask you about as well, about kind of engagement that you have with your audience, and that knowing, because I find it quite hard to, I'm very early in my podcasting journey, and one of the reasons why I joined Captivate is because they're a growth podcast platform, and I'd like to learn from them myself about growing my podcast. How have you found growing? Has it kind of happened organically, and then do you get a lot of engagement from your listeners that will know that you're to help you on the right track?
Yeah, I think there's a people often think, they'll say, oh, what's the blueprint for, you know, growing your podcast audience? And, you know, there's I wish there was like a one way, but things that how you launch a podcast can make a huge difference. So I'm working with a client at the moment who's launching a podcast in October, and one of the things that we're doing is trying to basically create almost like a flash mob, so that she's got a wait list of people who know the podcast is coming. They are excited it's coming, and you know, you can do this even if you have a tiny audience. You know, if you've got 3 people who are excited about it, that's better than like just showing up one day and going, hey, listen to our podcast. So it's about kind of letting people know that it's coming. So things like if I was launching a new podcast and I have to do this, here are my cover designs, like which one do you like the best? Or I'm thinking about calling it this, like, I'm thinking about doing my first season on this, and getting, even if it's a small amount of people who are following you on your email list or Facebook group, even if you have to ask all your friends or whatever, just letting people know it's coming before it happens, because I don't think any of us know the exact formula, but it's kind of received wisdom that the more people you can get listening when it goes live, and the more reviews that you can get, the more engagement basically the algorithm sees, then iTunes or whatever is going to think, oh, what's going on here? And it's more likely to get put in the, what do you call it on iTunes? The
charts.
It's going to impact on your charts, but also what do they call it? Like new and noteworthy, or it promotes certain things. So just not just kind of quietly, I've not tried a podcast, but if you've got an email list, if it's got 10 people on it, like tell those 10 people about it, tell them it's coming, give them a bit of an incentive if you can do. But basically, I always just try to get people listening on the first day, get them to go off and leave me a review. One little thing that I've learned about that is, if you want people to leave you a review, you need to show them how to do it, because they may not do it because they don't know how to do it. So do them a little video if you can. And these are all things I've learned along the way. But so that's the first thing, is actually launching it, actually telling people about it, not just rocking up and telling people. And then it's about, I think people sometimes get despondent with podcasts because they think they can launch a podcast and then, yes, there is, I mentioned at the beginning, yes, there is a kind of search element to it, that the people will be on the app looking for certain topics. So really thinking about your subject headers is really important as well. Sometimes people use really like mysterious sounding headers, but like actually, if you want people to find you because you're a virtual assistant that specializes in working with bookkeepers, it really pays to use bookkeepers or zeros, or zero, or like things that problems people are going to be looking for. So there's that kind of thing. But also social media, just a lot of people think, I've posted about my new episode. Like, well, post 5 more times, 6 more times, talk about it in different ways, because not everybody will see everything you post. If you've got an email list, even if it's got 15 people on it, email them. You just have to really keep getting on other people's podcasts. That's a whole other, being a podcast guest. So actually reaching out to people. I'm actually working on a kit at the moment, which I'm going to launch later in the year, a podcast content kit, which will have templates for things like show notes and social media posts, but also how to reach out to another podcast host and how to offer yourself as a guest. I don't know, Rachel, whether you ever get people pitching to be on your podcast, but most of them are terrible and they've not listened to the podcast. They haven't even bothered to scroll through. So you can stand out just by the way that you pitch yourself. And I know a lot of the podcasts I listen to are because I've been listening to someone else's podcast and they've had a guest on. I thought, that's interesting. And then I find out they've got a podcast. So that can be, so there's lots and lots of different things that you can do. But it's a long game, like you said, Rachel. You're not going to probably, be able to retire on the millions. I'll get people, when I've helped people launch podcasts before, and they're like, right, when can I get a sponsor? I was like, well, you have to be able to offer something to a sponsor first. Like you need to have an audience and some listeners, and it's not even about numbers. It's just about, you need to have the right people listening and all that kind of stuff. So you can never just leave it. I check in on my analytics every week, like sometimes more frequently. What can we do better? How can we do differently? Do we need to do more posts? It's quite hard sometimes when you're doing social media posts about podcasts, because you're like, hey, listen to this, it's on this. And then people don't interact in the same way as they might do with other content. So it's thinking about, how can I think of different ways to do this? So I realise that doesn't sound simple.
I think as well, it's not always that simple. Like when you're doing social media, even if it's not for your podcast, you want to post in different ways. And that was one thing I was going to ask you about, what things you do to promote your podcast. So do you find that when you post do you have posts like audiograms, or do you do video clips on your social media for your podcast? Or do you, because I try and sometimes take elements from an episode and try and make it into a different type of post that's maybe not necessarily saying listen to this in the beginning, because you're right, sometimes it's quite difficult to know how to promote it without it seeming like the same post over again and again.
Yeah, so audiograms, and if you're not familiar with what they are, you've probably seen them on social media. It's when people take a little clip
the audio clips.
They take a little clip from the podcast. I'm saying you as in the listener, not you, Rachel. I don't know what they are. But they that's because I've been podcasting for so many years. I know how to go, and if you don't know what they are, so the kind of
that's very good. You're right.
But there's the little video clips where you have it might be a really juicy quote from an episode. It's usually something to pull you in. I've got a real love-hate relationship with them because I have done them in the past, and I use them. My favourite tool is Capwing for that, and it's really great for creating. There's lots of different things. That's just my favourite one. But I find they don't actually work that well. Something that works better is me just switching the camera on and saying, hey, I've just done this podcast, it's about this. But I find, and this can be the case with lots of content, is that people zone out after a while. So they've seen so many of them that they just kind of switch off. And I found that there's two things. So one of them is, and I wouldn't say I've cracked it, because you think you've cracked it and then you're like, that's not working anymore, you need to do something else. But thinking about it more personally, so sometimes a topic of a podcast episode, I might find a photograph or something personal, or a personal story or something, and then talk about that, and then go, and by the way, I just made a podcast on this, and that type of thing tends to work better. The other thing is just the quality of the topic. So every so often I'll do a podcast episode which really spikes my listening, and usually it's something controversial, or it might just be a topic that maybe that not many people are creating content on or something, but really thinking about the content and just really thinking like, what's a topic that nobody else has covered in quite the same way, or maybe they've not really tackled this angle or something. But I find that just the kind of bog standard, it's annoying, but the bog standard, I've just published this podcast, all the audiograms, personally, I don't find they work that well. And talking to other podcasters, I think they would say the same. But, switching your camera on and just talking to people about what's in your podcast episode can be better. But as with all of these things, I'm sure there's people whose audiograms work brilliantly for them. And ultimately, it comes back to you testing out what works for you best and just doing more of what works. I wish I could say this works for everyone, but
there is a bit of testing involved in different posts and see what works well with your audience. And then it may differ from platform to platform, like Instagram compared to LinkedIn. Different things work on different audiences. I do like putting some things in my stories that get quite a good response. I find that my stories do more than my posts, have more interactions there. They don't do LinkedIn stories anymore, I don't think, but I do have. Sometimes my audiograms are okay, sometimes they're not. Maybe it just depends on who's on and, like you say, the subject. But I think that keeping consistent with it, whatever it is that you're doing, trying new things, keeping it consistent, as long as you're showing up and you're trying, I think that you can work those things out.
Yeah, we do like a base level of like we do the bog standard posts, we do them anyway, always, even if you're like, I wish I could get more. And then we try, and on top of that, we try and do things engaging, but also things like I did a behind the scenes stuff. So I was recording some podcasts. I was staying in a hotel and I needed to record some podcast stuff, and I'd forgotten a bit of my mic stand, so I had to use a toilet roll to as my mic stand. And I shared that photo and sort of reminding people that you're a podcaster, and maybe showing them what you're doing and what you're working on. If you edit your own podcast, maybe even showing you editing some of it, or I sometimes do if I've got guests coming on, just taking a picture of the two of you, or doing a little bit of video and talking about who's coming on. And I think what you're saying about stories, I think the reason it works is because it's more personal, and that's probably why my toilet roll works. Personal, it's more real, isn't it? And I think often we can just get stuck into doing those kind of almost like automated posts, where we're actually trying to think about how we can be a bit more creative about it.
Absolutely. I do find that sometimes myself, and I'm trying to batch my content and batch my podcast so that I don't get behind, so that I, those types of things. And you can get a little bit caught up with it being too mechanical, and you want to make sure that you keep it fresh and creative, and maybe just do some things off the hoof.
Yeah, maybe. If you can batch the sort of standard stuff, then you can, when you've got a little bit of time, you can try and do just off the cuff stuff, I think often works.
Yeah. Wow, I've learned so much from you today, Janet. Thank you so much for coming on. I wanted to just ask, well, you've offered lots of advice throughout the podcast. Is there your top piece of advice that you would give out to somebody perhaps starting, or who is maybe, a bit through their podcast and looking for a refresher, or they're starting to fade out with their podcast?
So you're asking about people who already have a podcast rather than beginners, or a bit of both?
Say someone who's already got a podcast maybe, and they're maybe losing interest or want a bit of because you've got that experience with having many changes with your podcast. Yeah, so
don't be afraid to change it. I just completely stopped mine because I made a podcast on it, of course, but I got to the point where it wasn't like I wasn't enjoying it anymore, but I felt like I was always really excited to interview people, and I was really excited to put episodes out. But I got to the point where it felt like it was starting to feel like a little bit of a chore, not too much, but a little bit. So in my case, it's quite extreme, which is like I stopped it and started a new one, which not every, but changing up the format. So I wish I could do more of it because I love doing it, but I did like some interviews with content creators, and they just took me so long to edit them. I was so proud of them, but it took me so long to edit, and I did a lot of the editing myself because I wanted to get the content right. Mm-hmm. But I actually switched to doing 4 short episodes a week, which sounds like a nightmare because I have this content planner that has, and the kind of methodology behind it is 4 styles of content 4 days a week. So basically I was publishing, say, the equivalent of 4 social media posts as podcast episodes. Now that might sound really, really scary, but actually if they're all 5 minutes long and you've got a bit of a plan going, so, and it just switches it up. It just gives your listeners something, and gives you actually something new to get stuck into. And if you're the kind of person like I did, I actually hired a podcast coach to help me after about 6 years, actually having somebody have a listen to help you with your interview style sometimes. And because although I was a journalist, I thought I was going to be pretty good at it, because I thought, I'm used to asking people questions, I'll be great. But actually, I was a print journalist, so part of what you do as a print journalist is you take your time and you can warm people up a little bit, and then when you come in with your killer question, you had some time to warm people up. Whereas on broadcast, you have to get in there quick. So I had a little bit of help just to kind of help me to kind of make my questions shorter, to get in there. I listen a lot to, when I'm listening to podcasts, I listen to how other people are asking questions, and I listen to, that was really good the way that they did that, or how did they get that how did they get that person to say that was so good. So I think depending on what really interests you, like I am really interested in interview, I'm interested in that side of it, but it might be about the formats, or it might be that you could have, if you just do a straight interview and it's always the same every time, maybe you could have some short solo episodes instead, or maybe you could switch it up so you have 2 minutes on this and 5 minutes on that. So I just think it's, if you're starting to feel a bit stale with it, but also the topics as well. Like I like doing things on more controversial topics, and that's probably not for a beginner. Like I think once you feel confident in your own voice, you could maybe tackle a few things which are a little bit more divisive. I personally, I love doing those episodes because that really does help. Like I did one on why I don't take part in big affiliate programs.
I saw that one. Yeah, I've listened to that one.
And I actually did an audiogram for that one. It did really well. But for those people who don't know, it's a bit of a divisive topic in the online space. And for me, they're a bit like MLMs. Like, so if you and it really heartfelt, I would never advise you saying anything that you don't agree with. But those sort of episodes where you're challenging something, or you're really potentially dividing people, they can be really, really good for your listenership. But also people get to know you as well. And also I think sometimes bringing a bit more of yourself into it as well, because I think sometimes we can get so focused on, having said you need to be strategic and like what to out, but actually sometimes even I think to myself, God, there's none of me in that. I listen back to your episodes, like the number of podcasters I know who don't listen to their podcast episodes. I sometimes listen to mine back about 3 or 4 times, which probably makes me sound like egotistical, but I actually listen critically so that I can think, oh, do you know what? I sound really boring there, or my tone of voice sounds boring. So I say I'm not interested in podcasting, but clearly I am.
Yeah.
But yeah, just I think in seeing where you could improve, I think can help a lot.
Yeah, that's I edit my own podcast episodes, and I do listen back sometimes halfway through recording if I've thought, oh, I'm not sure whether that's going the right way, and want to listen to my tone of voice. And to start with, I did feel like, oh, I'm putting on a voice here at this point. I don't want to put on a voice here. I think it can be really interesting, especially as well when you're starting out, as valuable as it is if you're, more established, if you may have just found yourself getting into a bit of a rut with certain things. I really like what you said about getting a podcast coach and looking at interview techniques, because I do struggle with interviews. I worry that, am I going to ask all the questions? Have I gone too much off on a tangent? I do get a bit nervous before I do interviews and things like that. So I think that if that is something that you struggle with, it's worth looking at that, different techniques. Funnily enough, I was listening to a Captivate podcast episode about being a guest, and they were sharing some tips and advice about how you can, if you get nervous about being a guest on someone else's podcast. It was really interesting.
Yeah. And I think if you are listening and you're thinking about starting a podcast, but you're nervous, one way to get used to your own voice is to be a guest on other people's podcasts. And all you need to do is have expertise. You don't need to have your own podcast. You don't need a special microphone or anything like that. Being in a quiet room and wearing headphones, most people are happy with that if you've got good content to share. But that can help you because somebody else is guiding you. The more you do, you'll get more experience. So that can help as well if you're nervous about starting it. But yeah, I think that it's a mistake to kind of start a podcast and think, oh, I know it all. And, I've been podcasting for years and I still sometimes listen back and think, oh, for God's sake, I'm doing that again. And also not to worry about the things that we worry about, I think, are not the important things. Like I start a lot of sentences with so, or.
Exactly. I do that as well.
But actually they're not the things that, it can be really jarring if you're doing it every sentence, but often the bits that could really help us are more about, getting to the question faster or not missing. One of my favorite podcast hosts is Michael, oh God, what's his name? The social media marketing world guy, the social media marketing podcast. I forget his name now, but
I'll find it and link it in the show notes.
He always loves Michael Stelzner. He always asks the question that I think, oh, but what about that? And then he asks the question. And sometimes when I'm listening to myself back, I think, oh, I didn't ask the question that everybody wanted to ask.
Be thinking, yeah.
Yeah, and I know this can seem a lot when you're first starting, but I think these are things, good practice that you can put in place from your very first podcast season. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that is important. And then, or still thinking about future things for yourself if you are starting out and you think, well, I'd love to be here, but I know that I'm here right now. What can I do to help evolve myself over X amount of time to get to the place I want to be? And like we've said about barriers, that the perfectionism thing, like if I'd have been too perfectionist about my podcast, I don't think I would have started one about, talking to different people and my voice and all those kind of things that you have. But you have to start somewhere. And once you've started, you can only get better from there and out.
Exactly. And just remember, everybody hates their voice. Everybody is critical. Everybody listens back and thinks, oh, why did I say that? Or that was a stupid question, or I should have asked that question. And all we can do is just try and get better. And you will. Like, if you keep showing up and doing it, you will get better.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Jen. I can suspect we could talk for hours on podcasting. I've got so many other questions for you, but I'll finish it there. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been really great, and you've had some really great advice and insights to offer for my guests, and I hope everyone enjoys this episode. Would you like to just quickly let us know where we can find you?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is my website, which is janetmurray.co.uk. And if you want to connect with me on social media, I'm everywhere because content's my thing, but Instagram is the best place, and I'm at janmurrayuk.
Brilliant. I will link all those in the show notes so everyone can find you super easily. So thanks again, Janet. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please like, share and subscribe. Your support means so much to me. If there's a question or topic you'd like covering, then I'd love to hear from you. Find the podcast on Instagram at Rachie Botfield and drop me a DM. Till next time, bye.